are now tuned in to the Last of Its Kind podcast, produced by humans, made for humans.
Yo, check this out.
We connect the streets.
Let's do it then!
Yeah, baby!
This is Mike Johns, Check This Out News, reporting live each and every week. And with us today, we have a special guest, Dr. Alan S. Young.
And what you have seen, I think, over the past 20 years, both here in the US and around the world, especially in China the last 10, 15 years, is that there's a disintermediation, meaning we're cutting out the middleman.
Yeah.
And therefore, we don't need to pay for it. We don't need the inefficiency because of the supply chain or the delay of delivery or the extra pair of hands.
He's a seasoned C-suite executive working with Global 100 companies, startups, very well experienced in US, Europe, and Asia. And we're going to be talking about the subject matter, the rise of Temu, the Chinese social app. Should America be concerned? Dr. Alan Young, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Mike. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with your audience.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm very happy to have you. I thought this subject matter has been very pressing, and your background, accolades, the book, awesome book, is The Flying Eagle.
Church.
I think is just stellar to this subject matter. And so what I'd like to do is really dive in. We look at consumer electronics, and America loves consumer electronics. Social media, consumer electronics, that's it. In 2024, going forward, that's what the big buzz is. I'm curious, why do countries like China, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan dominate the consumer electronics space?
I think over the past 30 years, and that was actually being discussed in my book and subsequently in other venues, there was a move of globalization, and manufacturing was moving offshore and eventually into Asia Pacific and ending up mainly in China, where some of the outsourcing was done. The design work, some of the components, engineering were done at places like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong.
What year would you say that this started to take place?
I think the onset was the early 1990s, Mike, because the idea of the world being flat and we have division of labor. Let's do the things that we're good at in America, which is the high-end engineering, some of the design work, and in some cases, marketing or programming for that matter.
I see.
Some of the medium end and maybe labor-intensive work were increasingly moved offshore. Initially go to places like Mexico and Southeast Asia, but eventually all gravitated into mainland China because the scale they had in China and eventually the cost that they can achieve drove everything.
You have a point there, but do you have an answer?
So that actually went all the way until perhaps the year 2017 and 18 with the trade dispute between China and the US, but later on really accentuated and highlighted with COVID-19, the pandemic, with all these changes and disruption of supply chain. And now people are talking about decoupling or de-risking, the world now separating into two different supply chains, one of them led by China, which would include, according to our Secretary of Commerce, Taiwan, and maybe some of our allies like Japan and also Korea. And then the other one led by China and remain to be a force for reckon with for years to come.
That is a fantastic idea.
So I think the episodes are still unfolding at this point.
Very good point. Would it be safe to say that was it America that looked to do outsourcing in Asia? Was this an idea that Asia created on its own, or did it come from the US? Motorola was in the 90s, right? Once upon a time, when I, as a kid, going back and forth to, and just talking about phones, for example, phones, my cousins in Europe used to have the advanced phones, and then there was our Motorola. All of that shifted, and it's now Asia. You're saying that Europe or America played a role in that?
Well, I think the West, especially America, tremendous role from both the end-use consumer basis but also in terms of OEM and the design thinking, and also the product development. Of course, our market drive the world consumption and taste and trends, but at the same time, our biggest name, and you mentioned Motorola, and
Yes.
back then also there was Nokia that
Yes.
was for phones. Back then it was called feature phones. Most people don't
Yes.
even know that. But now there's something called smartphone that can do a lot more than just making phone calls.
Yes.
More and more electronics is packed into the phone, and more design and manufacturing requirements are really needed to make it happen. So increasingly, you find that supply chain initially done in places like Taiwan and Korea, and later on the Korean manufacturers, the Taiwan manufacturers, most of them move into mainland China, especially for the labor-intensive work, and eventually the rise of these outsourced manufacturer, the so-called Foxconn or
Yes.
other places like Jabil, or they become the outsourcing partner for the OEM like Motorola and Nokia. And Nokia and Motorola will be responsible for product development and product management, but making the product, working with supply chain, assembling the devices, hiring the laborer to do the work, and then really managing the literally 100 to 200,000 employees in a factory campus. There's something the Asians, especially the Taiwanese and the mainland Chinese, have done and perfected to the max.
Church.
Got it. And what about countries like the Vietnam and the Philippines? There's other countries in Asia. Why were they seem to be left out of the electronic boom?
I think it was basically the same thing about economy of scale. I lived in China for about 14 years, between 2003 to about 2017. When you talk to not just electronics OEM, but you talk to people like the senior VP of KFC in China, you ask them, hey, why are you not opening more stores in Malaysia or Indonesia? This is like 10, 15 years ago.
Right.
They said, you know what? If I succeed in Malaysia and Indonesia, it's still a very small country. But bear in mind, Indonesia is like several hundred million people. But for them to succeed in China, basically would be a lot better than pick on a few countries to do well. By the same token, when they start scaling up and start looking for cost and scale, it makes more sense to move some of the factories from Southeast Asia and all migrated into mainland China. Initially near the coast, like Shanghai, Kunshan, Shenzhen area, but later on, when our computers become lighter, more people using laptop and phones are pretty light, and notebooks and notepads, the components don't need to be shipped. They can be flown in, so the inbound logistics can be by plane, so you no longer need to be on the coastline of China.
Yes.
So now, after about 10, 15 years, it becomes expensive to assemble phones and computer, and in the coastal area like Shenzhen and Shanghai, they start moving inland to places like Chongqing and Chengdu and Zhengzhou, because now you can fly the components in, and after you actually manufacture or assemble the product, you fly them out.
Got it.
So you don't need the boats and the container ships anymore for that.
Yes.
Right? Unlike TVs, you still may need to do that. But phones and computers,
Lighter equipment.
consumer electronics, is all by air.
Yes, good point. And you touched on this when we looked at phones. Once upon a time, Motorola was made in the U.S., Nokia over there in Finland, and all of that is in Asia. Do you see a day that a phone could be made back in the U.S.?
I think there was a question posed by President Obama quite a few years ago, and he was very adamant and very, very eager to try to make it possible for the A company to do that. I think a lot of people had looked into it, because right now it's still economically very challenging because the cost differential is very high.
Right.
And therefore, the work shift solution has been, if you don't necessarily do all that in China, they talk about maybe taking some of the concentration risk out of making all your products in China, maybe a small portion or at least a sizable portion could be done somewhere else. And you mentioned Vietnam, that was the number one choice of destination as an alternate manufacturing site outside of China. And lately, is now India for two reasons. Vietnam is not a very big country. It's a very sizable country, but it's not a billion population. And therefore, the availability of labor is not quite there. But also, when a lot of these OEM went to China, part of that was outsourcing and lower the manufacturing costs, but also gaining scale. Part of that was the allure of going into China. And you remember that Coca-Cola idea is like if you sell one bottle to every person in China, is 1.2 or 1.4 billion bottles.
Yes.
The same idea, and Apple and other OEM had done excellent work and very much succeeded in really penetrating the market and introduced the Apple product like iPhone and iPad to the general populace in China. So now that portion has been done. And with COVID and the pandemic highlighting that even though China is a great place for manufacturing, maybe you can't have all your eggs in one very nice basket, even though it has been very, very supportive and been very, very accommodating and very low cost. So initially look at Vietnam, but now the last few years they look at India with this kind of characteristics that China had 15 years ago.
Wow.
This huge and educated labor force, very diligent people, but a consumer market is still untapped for some of these 3C, consumer electronics, computer, or communication products. So that's why India has been now really the place to invest and the place to manufacture. And we're going to see a lot more products coming out of India.
Interesting. I thank you for that. Now, that goes to my point. Dr. Young, you're a consumer electronics expert. Again, a C-suite exec. I haven't even spoke about the big thing that you've done working with Foxconn, bringing that to the U.S., also an author. I'm curious, when you look at, again, consumer electronics, let's start with America and retail outlets like Radio Shack. Radio Shack to Circuit City to Best Buy to now social shopping. A lot has changed. I'm curious, what do you see as trending with the people formerly known as the customer? What have you seen in this 50-year span from when Radio Shack was on the market to Best Buy look like they're losing in their value proposition? You go into a Best Buy store only to compare the prices with who? Amazon. Notice how I'm setting you up, Doc. I'm just setting you up, but I'm kind of curious. What have you seen in the trends of how people shop?
Okay, I can give you a bit of background both on the manufacturing side and the supply chain as well as retail because representing Foxconn, I actually set up a joint venture with Media Saturn, which is the Best Buy of Europe. And we actually had a venture in China for quite a few years. And that was the onset of internet or e-commerce in China. This is the year 2009, 2010. And what you have seen, I think, over the past 20 years, both here in the US and around the world, especially in China, the last 10, 15 years, is that there's a disintermediation, meaning we're cutting out the middleman.
Yes.
And therefore, we don't need to pay for it. We don't need the inefficiency because of the supply chain or the delay of the delivery or the extra pair of hands. When Dell and HP and other OEMs were manufacturing laptop or notebooks back then, they still have this one or two touch thing, right? But after a while, they said, no, we designed it, we own the IP, but outsourcing company, big manufacturing giant like Foxconn, you build it for me. It's all my spec, all my design, but I work with you as a partner. That's what called no touch. The Apple or the Dell or the Hewlett Packard never touched the product. Same thing here. But I think for the internet, connecting the consumer back to the manufacturing floor or the factories is exactly what's happening. Okay, 5 years ago was already taken for granted because Apple have mastered the supply chain in terms of outbound logistics. I remember 10, 12 years ago, I was flying out of China, and by then, when you're ordering an iPad or I think it was back then an iPod.
Yes, iPod.
You basically are flying in about the same time product bought on the internet, because for them to come out from China for the factory floor onto you to your stop or your home, it takes about a day or two. It's not like a week or two. It was that efficient. But now what you're seeing is innovation and creativity in terms of allowing consumer to go direct. So the direct to consumer innovation sometimes is, maybe shopping experience or presentation or merchandising. Sometimes it's reverse auction. So all kinds of things like, if you go to Europe, they have like, a site that go to 12 midnight, and now all of a sudden you got these offers. This is incredible. So everybody stay up at night, just wait for that to happen.
Right.
But with the like of Alibaba, they have really done well in China, essentially bring some of the products from manufacturing floor, directly sell to the Chinese consumer, and eventually not just for the off-brand or maybe questionable quality, they also brought in the high brand name, using the Temu concept. So all that was happening in the past, I would say 10, 12 years, and it's all compressed into one thing that China now, the government have to tell the people, cash is mandatory, cash is actually allowed. You cannot not take cash as a mean of payment, because everybody is doing digital money. Nobody actually uses cash. So the uptake of using technology in China is very fast, along with 1 billion consumer. And Temu has like 900 million subscribers in China. So you can see the speed, the scale. So these innovators from China, be it in social media like TikTok or in e-commerce like Shein or Temu, they are taking some of the innovation and creativity and start applying outside of China.
That's fascinating. And where did you come by this information?
Places like Southeast Asia and Korea, but the Taj Mahal really is the US and the US market.
Right.
And the past few years is amazing, especially with Temu.
I'm curious, why do you think American shoppers like the discount app Temu?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. I don't know if you would answer to one person with the same answer to the other. I think the fact that they made it very compelling with some of the discounts.
Okay.
They also, provide a very fun and interesting experience. Some people never play games. Some people love playing games. And I remember
that's one of the creatives that they've done. When you spoke on innovation and creativity, Temu has pretty much gamified the shopping experience.
Yes, but that's not new. I mean, if you remember, the
new
world,
in America, right?
For electronics retailers, the world, after Circuit Cities and whatnot, the world became three players.
Yeah.
One is Best Buy in the U.S., and then Media Saturn in the Europe market, and then Yamada Denki in Japan. They basically are the three biggest electronic retail chains in the world. And Yamada Denki had one of these exactly like Temu. You can go in there and actually register, get your coupon or get your points. You can spin the wheel. You can actually get offers, sometimes basically free money. And people can't believe it. Well,
Right.
Why? Because you're brought into the store once a month, once a week, in
Right.
some cases once a day. When I
Right.
was in retail 12 years ago in China, we brought a lot of consumers or shoppers into our store in Shanghai once a day, because it was a fun, interesting experience, and it was comfortable, it was enjoyable. Sometimes you get elderly grandpas and grandma bringing in the grandkids because the adults is hard at work, but they actually hang around. And sometimes you see things, a mouse pad, oh wow, $10. But if you buy 5, this is actually $3. You just split your heads like, why is it more? Actually, it's less.
Right.
But that's the kind of offer that get you shocked. And then you say, okay, I guess I can do that. If I make a mistake, it's $3.
And that's big
the
for
concept that Temu took it and make it digitalized and took it to the world, but also using the marketing capability, the social media marketing, to really actually take it to the next level, because you can scale, you can see what work. I mean, I think what they try in Korea or try in China and the US may or may not work, but they get instant feedback. And this is why they, pay, Facebook and Google tremendous amount of advertising dollars or marketing dollars.
Yes.
This platform works. You get instant feedback, and you can actually re-up or you can modify and run a different campaign. So it's very difficult for a brick and mortar store to compete.
Right.
And that's why it's a difficult challenge for the likes of Best Buy, but I wouldn't write them off because I think they have survived Internet 1.0 and 2.0 back then. I think there's still a value proposition for them. But the challenge really is not just Temu these days, because I think retail stores have to carry the rent, and they have to actually watch out for the shrinkage. They have to pay a lot more for the labor and the actually shopkeepers. So it's a different value proposition, and it's going to be interesting to see whether they can actually hang around and be successful again after this wave of challenges.
Absolutely. Well, I love, again, what you said about the creativity. And I think the point that I was making, that gamifying, that may have taken place in both Asia and Europe, but it really hasn't been kicked off in the US. And I think that's where the app becomes exciting. Even just the slogan, shop like a billionaire,
Yes, indeed.
Say that. They have simple slogans that doesn't really capture that. And then the fact that you go to the app and then there's this wheel, like the Wheel of Fortune, it's game on.
I think the Temu is an interesting and very, very successful company. One thing that I've noticed them is they have been a very successful follower in the case of AliExpress, who was in Korea before them, Shein here for fast fashion in the US, and in China, Ali. So they have been able to offer something better than the incumbent, and they also have been able to spend marketing dollars like no tomorrow. But in the case of the US, it wouldn't quite work as much in China to shop or act like a billionaire, because that slogan wouldn't necessarily work. But that tells you the local team headquartered in Boston know what they're doing, understand that American consumer and their taste and the likes and the trends. So that's actually quite fascinating.
Yeah, it's scary, right? At the same time.
Oh, yes, indeed.
They've collected the data.
They have the scale to fall back on in China, both in terms of the programmers, in terms of the users or subscribers, but also in terms of the suppliers and the manufacturers. So what they have not done is to conquer a particular market, including Alibaba. Because Alibaba was so similar to Amazon, and therefore it was not an easy egg to crack, and they were not able to do that. But if you bring, Temu here, they're offering something very different from Amazon, and honestly, quite a few other retailers, be it online or brick and mortar. So I think they are doing quite well. But they also start competing and actually won over Shein. So the first thing to do is someone had proved the concept. You're doing much better than them, whether it's in China against Ali and JD, or in Korea against AliExpress, and now in America against Shein. It's amazing. And they have that kind of audacity to spend the marketing spend. We know the Super Bowl ads.
We know the Super Bowl ads.
And we know how much they would spend on the coupons and the discount, because it's the same playbook that Amazon was very successful for the longest time. I remember seeing Amazon, emerging out of nowhere in the late 1990s, and was become very successful. Jeff Bezos was a genius back then and still is right now. But after about 10, 15 years, people start asking, when are you going to be profitable, Mr. Amazon?
Right.
And they never did, because for them, the first mover advantage become gaining the market share and crowding out the competition and offering better experience, better value proposition. And the Wall Street and investor was patient enough not to demand profit. Right now, it's the same thing with Temu, because Shein, Amazon, Ali, all these players and competitors of Temu, they have to make money now. They cannot be
Absolutely.
losing money
Right.
and gaining market share like Temu has been doing the past few years.
Now, do you see that it's because of this ad buy that they did in the U.S. that the app would make its way to be number one in the store, the Apple Store for 23 as a free?
They already, I think, was number one for the past few months. I don't know what the ranking would be, but the crazy thing is that between Temu and TikTok and another tool or app that was owned by TikTok were really at the top 5.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to be occupied by Amazon and maybe
Walmart
and Target.
Yeah.
Now it's all Chinese. And part
Yeah.
of that is what I've been saying is they have the scale, both in terms of programming talent, they have the ability to test the market, and also they have the crucible in China where competition is extremely fierce. If you go back to the 1970s and 80s, it's kind of dated my age. We kind of worried about the Japanese automakers because they were very, very successful, very high quality, very competitive, but because they within the Japan market, they competed fiercely. It's the same thing here in China. And so the Temu, the Ali, the JD, and all these other players were competing, and it's really a bloodbath. But after a few years, if you can still survive,
right,
and you can go out and exporting your merchandise, exporting your EV is actually pretty formidable.
Right.
And I think that's what we're seeing from the government right now, the concern about EV, the concern about these other products being made with scale, maybe in some cases, maybe below cost,
right,
and therefore potentially a big threat to our jobs and our security here. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing here.
You got me wanting to ask some other questions. So when you mentioned, the Chinese and they have a very deep-rooted understanding on the American consumer, that becomes a little bit concerning because it's all about data, and that ties into TikTok. And it's interesting. You have TikTok, and already, in a conspiracy theory world, it's funny that America's reward through likes and followers for dumb stuff, whereas in China, good behavior allows more access onto gaming platforms. That's a disadvantage right there. But I'm kind of curious, when we look at where that data is going, right? That data ultimately could help Chinese know more about the consumer. So if it's, hey, look at what these silly things that they seem to glorify, that's collecting data on the psyche of the consumer. And that's why I see, I'm torn between TikTok being banned, and then that raises concern about Temu.
Mm-hmm. I think those are valid concerns. It will be up to these companies to be able to make their case that it should not be a concern for both the consumers and the governments. I can't say how successful they would be. Another route will be through the legal channel, the First Amendment, right? That kind of stuff. And those are a long way out there. Quite honestly, I think our government, the US government, is probably one of the best in terms of utilizing the internet and social media to influence, information and behavior, whether actually arresting or maybe discerning disinformation, or protecting our homeland, or protecting our national security. We just don't know it. I think on the other hand, the Chinese has been pretty clear about what they're doing in mainland China.
Yes.
And there's always a concern whether that would be also done outside of China. And I can't say how that would be. But I think the rules and the regulations and the norms in Europe will become, I think, a lot more important.
When we look at the security, this whole data, the collection of data, I think America, especially based on age, are concerned as to what's happening with this data. And there's probably a disconnect when they realize that the parent company is China. And so when we're looking at Temu, now you've even made it clear that hey, there are algorithm scientists that are really studying what Americans are doing as far as shopping and what have you, and this becomes a superior power that Temu has in knowing how to reach an American, whether you're in California or Florida. There's only 6 degrees of separation, and they have the algorithm for that. Would you agree?
What the correlation between geodata and other data that you can glean from different places or cross between different sites is something of a concern. I think from a privacy, but also from a security matter. For us in the U.S., a lot of these retailers, a lot of these brand owners, they know a lot about us. Okay, between the cookies, between our social media
Yeah.
contacts, in some cases, these bots actually read our email. They tell you, well, you got this email 3 days ago, should you reply there? It's like, 10, 15, 20 years ago, you start scratching your head and say, you know what? I think, Google is reading my email. Now it's not even a question anymore because how could the AI and the assistant not
Yes.
be able to help you if they
Yes.
don't read your email? Now the
Right.
question is, how far does it go? And I think in our cases, there are certain rules and boundaries,
Yeah.
but still the laws and the regulations are still kind of sketchy and not quite mature. In the case of China, I think people's conception is there is no difference between commercial and state because the companies basically report into the states under certain rules. In the US, less so. I mean, we saw Twitter and Facebook and Google in some cases under some pressure because of FBI or because of the pandemic. They worry about this information. I think the extent might be different. The concern is similar.
Yes.
But I think for us to make a case that, hey, we should ban this one and not ban that one, it's a very tough case. It
Very
really
tough.
is.
I
I
got
think
you.
eventually both the consumer, but also the legislature, along with the legal system, is going to play out and decide. It may take a few years to get there, but we'll see.
So you're thinking with this case regarding TikTok, do you think that that actually will go through? Like, do you think that that actually will be banned?
I think it's the biggest challenge for the government to make this case is going to be through legal
Hmm.
in the First Amendment right. And I think there are
First Amendment,
cases out
right?
there
It seems like
stating,
we're set. It's a setup, though, and Mr. Trump. It's like he's kind of changed his tone. Initially, he was first to be really, we need to ban TikTok. Now he's taken a step back. Uh, if there is a ban on TikTok, then that's going to be to the betterment of Mark Zuckerberg and all the others, right? Because what happens to those subscribers? So it gets really sticky, right?
yeah, but then if you ban Temu, I think Mr. Zucker may not like it because Temu is now the number one advertising client of Meta system,
Wow.
right? So it comes and go, one way or the other. But I think in this case, for TikTok, it is a great app, it's a great platform. And I
Hmm.
think a lot of folks here in the US would love to be able to buy the US subsidiary of TikTok and own
Yes.
it. Because if the government make you sell it, you're not going to really get a good price.
Yeah, exactly.
You can actually get a pretty good bargain and create tremendous value. Whether that route would happen, I don't know. But I
Hmm.
think, from a government versus corporate perspective, it's going to take a few years to play out. And who knows, few years from now, what the landscape would look like. I think the prior administration versus the current one, they all have the concerns. It's
Hmm.
interesting to see how, different levers were pulled. I was surprised when some of these tariffs and sanctions were slapped on China in
Yes.
2018 and then later on 19 and even 2020. But then if you look back, those were not that harsh anymore. Under our current administration, the Biden administration, they were even more onerous. And will be interesting to see how that will play out the next few years. But what that means really is from a global supply chain, for manufacturers and brand owners and OEM, along with ourselves being consumer, the world is changing very rapidly.
Yes.
Some of the things that we took it for granted back then, meaning let's do free trade, flow of goods, flow of talent, flow of currency, uh, is now being slowed down and in some cases curtailed. And therefore, what used to be one gigantic happy family, everything kind of made in China, is no longer welcome. And
Right.
therefore, now got split into two. The de-risking term is a polite way of decoupling, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And therefore, at the end of the day, it will be interesting to see amongst the two supply chains, how much overlap they would be. I don't think the big names, the OEMs, the companies that make our phones and TV, whatnot, they will totally exit China. But I think they will get to the point that, okay, we want to be in China, not because of the manufacturing talent and the government policy, but also because of the consumer, but it's also because, as I actually alluded in my book, you don't want to just participate or address the US market or the other one. You
Right.
want to be able to sell into both. I think the like of Tesla, the like of Apple, and maybe Volkswagen want to be able to do that. And the successful company will transcend that. And I remember JP Morgan said they've been around for 100 years. They want to be and will be in China for years to come. So they need to find a way to be in both. But
Yes.
then they may not make all the products or they may not make all the sales in one country. And that's why there will be two supply chains led by the G2, the US
Yes.
being the head, and then the West, European countries, Korea, and Japan, and Taiwan, and then China being the incumbent in terms of manufacturing, in terms of supply chain. But now with the restrictions and the technology sanctions and whatnot, it's now becoming a very treacherous environment. So it will be interesting to see how the geopolitics play out in the next few years.
Do you think is there a U.S. trade war on the electronics industry now?
It is not called a trade war, but it really is because
That's why I'm asking.
technology war,
Right.
right? And I think back then it was under the Trump administration, it was first salvo of a trade war. And if you've done a couple of these tariffs and sanctions, I'm going to retaliate. So I think back then was still a bit moderate. Right now, we're looking at, who is actually gaining the upper hand on the technology war, which precede a trade war, right? So you could be
Technology
looking
war.
at global finance, you could be looking at supply chain, trade, and even flow of people, right? Nowadays, there are certain countries where their citizens are not welcome because they're embroiled in a certain conflict in Europe or in the Middle East, and somehow their visa are revoked. So the flow of people are no longer as free as 5 or 10 years ago. By the same token, if I cannot get enough NVIDIA, A100 or B200
Yes.
GPU chipsets, I can't compete with you on the long term with AI. The only way I can do it is daisy chained up, the lesser components or GPU together to try to actually make do. But then another way is, okay, well, I'm going to do my training in a place where I can do the training, but I'm going to do my computing and machine learning and AI in other places. The two companies that came to mind right now is exactly that, right? Tesla
Yes.
is taking their data from China because China has been very advanced in autonomous or self-driving, and they have been a lot more aggressive. Therefore, there are a lot more data there. But then they don't have the NVIDIA GPU in terms of massive AI servers and
Right.
computing capability. So now Tesla is running all the training, the AI servers onshore here in the US. By the same token, if you want to work on American consumer behavior, the data is collected here, and maybe your training is also done here. So
Right.
the data flow in the background between the big companies, between the e-commerce site along with the government, is something that I think most of us normal consumer don't really understand. But I think we're learning a lot more based on these national security and privacy concerns.
Very good point. What would happen if the U.S. stopped buying from China?
I
I'm
think
curious, just from your
it
optics,
could
what
be a
actually
very
happened?
chaotic situation. I
Mhm.
think they would not take a carte blanche and black and white situation like that. Will always be a gray area, meaning the U.S. government policies, at least the past few years, has been gradually ratcheting up the pressure and the sanction and the restriction, but not do a very big what they call the nuclear approach because there's no turning point, there's no point of return there. But then the bad thing is you get your tit for tat. Also, it's kind of one of those things that you call, the boiling frog kind of syndrome.
Hmm.
It's getting harder and harder, getting more and more uncomfortable until at some point it's like, boy, this is fatal. That's actually going to be bad.
Right.
And I think we're getting closer and closer when you combine, politics and geopolitics
Hmm.
with some of the flashpoint around the world between the US and China, along with the trade war, the technology war, the IP or standard war, and of course the currency and the commerce and the finance. Um, the technology piece is actually interesting. When I was in China a few years ago, back then the concern about Huawei was 5G
Yes.
because Huawei was really very much advanced when compared to the other two vendors like Ericsson and Nokia.
Hmm.
They have the best gear, they have the best price, best install base, third world country, first world country like the UK, a lot of that in the US. But the concerns were raised with the US government, the intelligence community. I think that got stopped. And Huawei really was cut basically off in midair. And that took them a few years to recover. And they did. It's pretty
Yeah.
amazing. But 5G is nothing compared to right now, which is AI. Because I think AI, now you got all this data. There's only how much a human or group of humans can analyze. So
Right.
once you figure out the tools and the model and the training and the algorithm, now you're comparing computing power. And I think that interesting point now is what we're looking at, who has the more capability in terms of talent, who had more AI servers and GPUs. But then if you look at what happened the last few years is, I think the statistic I heard was every 3 days, there's a new server or data center being put up. And nowadays, this is not your plain vanilla data center because if you do your data center, you may as well make it AI server or data center. Um, but there are a couple of caveats to that. Well,
Mhm.
you got to have your tools, your GPUs, and your servers. And Foxconn made a tremendous amount of those, along with a few other vendors. But you also need to have the sites. You need to have the power, the grid, and also you have to have at least real estate to do that. So recently, the site that we've been working on in Wisconsin, I call it Wisconsin Valley, which will be the title of my second book. Uh,
Riscon Valley.
yes, indeed. We had that term coined a few years ago, and people figure out why Wisconsin Valley or Southeast Wisconsin Racine is such an interesting and compelling place to be. And I think Foxconn came, Intel took a look. Now Microsoft is making a lot more investment in this
Yes.
area for data center and
Dr.
presumably.
Young, it's as if you already know my questions. It's like you're flowing. It's like you already.
Well, maybe we can connect through our conversation. I
Yeah.
enjoy speaking with you, Mike.
Yeah, and
You
let
know,
me add this to it. With all the hot, we have some hot spot markets in the US, the tech sector, obviously, Silicon Valley at the forefront. You have been the poster child for Wisconsin. You're talking about Intel. Intel's moving their world headquarters to Ohio. That's where they've broken ground. What do you see attractive about these states for Asia?
well, back then we looked at reshoring manufacturing back to the US, and there are a few very important or key factors. One of them, actually the most important, was really talent. And if you look at the US education market, the higher education, the upper Midwest, the places where, you can find Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, and Minnesota. I mean, I'm naming the Big Ten universities. Universities, these have both from the scientific standpoint, the engineers, but also people who have great liberal education, who could be a linguist, who could be, maybe user interface designer and things like that. So that was our number one criterion back then. And of course, the cost of doing business, the heritage of actually supporting manufacturing, the heritage of actually supporting government and partnership with industry, those are very important things. So if you look at Michigan, you look at Ohio, Wisconsin, Indiana, those are places where you've seen very friendly and supportive government. And also going back, these were the states where we lost a lot of the manufacturing jobs. So interestingly, that's how we're coming back. But 5-7 years ago, there was a challenge. One of them was the cost of doing business is still high when compared to China. And also the cost of doing business here and making products is high compared to Mexico. So a lot of times people would think, if I do it here, it's going to be 20% higher than Mexico or 40% higher than China. So how do I cope with that? So in the past few years, the Biden administration have equalized or leveled a bit of the playing field. And therefore, with some of the tariffs or maybe some of the sanctions, maybe on solar panels for EV or lithium battery, you're now seeing a little bit more of the field that you can compete. Otherwise, we will be flooded with EV made from China, which would not be very good. I think the Chinese folks will still be able to compete, but it's not really as easy anymore. So I think that would be one. But one of the most interesting things that had happened the last 2-3 years is called energy. And the prime example really is AI data center.
Yes.
But think about making lithium-ion battery, assembling EV. If you do a Google search and you type something keyword in there, it comes back instantly. And I think the number was it uses like 2 or 3 watt hours in terms of energy. But if you do a chat GPT, you type in the same thing, it uses 10 times or more of the energy. So in essence, you're actually cranking a lot more within your AI server or data center or the cloud, the AI cloud, with everything like for like between now versus 5 years ago, 5 years later, because no longer you're just searching restaurant. You type something in there and the AI bot or the chat GPT is doing a lot more heavy lifting for you. It's using a lot of energy. So where can you find reliable grid along with energy sources, along with microgrid, and maybe long duration storage is where you're going to put your servers, where you're going to put your energy intense manufacturing plant there. Now, back then it was like, okay, you're burning coal, it's no good. But now if you're renewable and you have capability to store some of those in flow battery or maybe lithium-ion battery so that it can actually backflow within 4 to 10 hours because some days there are winds, some days there's no sun. So you can store some of those. And now our energy costs here in the US used to be pretty low. The only place that you can compete was actually Oregon and Washington State because they have hydropower. But now if you're doing wind, you're doing solar, you have very economically viable or competitive storage solution like flow battery. Now we actually are very competitive. We're even more competitive than China when you're so energy intensive. And you couple some of that with robotics and automation, we
Hmm.
could be very, very competitive on a global basis. And knowing our ingenuity with OEM and American manufacturing,
Right.
they will figure out where to do the part in Vietnam or in Mexico and where to do the value add here in Wisconsin or Michigan or Ohio. I think right now, the leading product segments are still EV, semiconductor,
Yes.
and maybe servers, right? Servers is interesting because, okay, servers, to put it really unfairly, servers is super souped up computers. Back then, 10, 15, 20 years ago, a very powerful PC from Dell could be like a low-end server. But essentially, that's what you have. Very powerful computers now with CPU and GPU. But hey, if you need to configure your servers,
Right.
you got your hardware here, racks up at racks, you are not really comfortable configuring your server offshore.
Mm.
So you want to be able to do it onshore, especially for some of the military or intelligence cloud or server capability. That's
Yeah.
why Northern Virginia has a lot of those because of the government and being close to the DoD and CIA and FBI.
Makes sense.
For the same reason, you want your configuration done onshore on American soil. Back then, 5, 10 years ago, they were still comfortable with Taiwan. Now they probably are not. So please assemble or make your server here or somewhere else, but I
Mhm.
definitely will actually sample here. So
Yeah.
at some point, the vertical integration of that idea would be more and more of the Google or the Facebook or the Apple server would be assembled in the US. And I think Wisconsin is getting a share of that. And then more of that being assembled here, of course, the configuration will also be done here after they assemble.
Yes.
In the case of Microsoft, speaking highly of my former employer, Foxconn, if they
Mhm.
can build a server in the manufacturing site and be able to ship it next door to the server farm or the data center that
Yeah.
Microsoft is building, why not? It
Exactly.
would be beautiful, wouldn't it be?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a perfect segue. We've covered a lot here, and I want to do the last segment of this, kind of plugging in on the Flying Eagle and the upcoming book, Risk-On Valley. You spoke on Foxconn. Foxconn, you played a pivotal role and it's also discussed in the book, how Foxconn made its way to the U.S. And one of the things, this is kind of putting you on the spotlight, but when you look at the promises that were made under the Trump administration, the governor of Wisconsin, and Foxconn itself, where are those goals, those promises? It looks like now there's a lesson learned, but what happened?
I think what happened is going to be the answer from the book that I'm going to be publishing in a few months.
Part
But I
two.
can give you an idea. I think the point is that both sides decide the original concept would not work. So they came to an amiable conclusion and say, let's redo the contract. As a result, the footprint and the investment was not as big as originally planned or thought. But then, if you ask a governor from a particular state around here, would you still be happy looking back 5, 7 years that a company come in and invest 1.5 or $2 billion in your state, and maybe putting you along with your colleagues on the map because Foxconn decided to put allegedly $10 billion, and the governor and the president of the United States would come through a few times, I think that's still a good thing.
Yes.
But what's better than having Foxconn here is to have Foxconn and another company here. Well, we didn't get Intel to come, too bad, but then Ohio actually had the benefit. Well,
Right.
congratulations to them. But we have Microsoft here. So we are celebrating, we're trying to figure out ways to support and do better in support of them. And potentially would be other companies to come through. The title of my book being Wisconsin Valley is because not just the name of the project in the post-signing phase, Wisconsin Valley. Our vision really is to try to help Wisconsin and Upper Midwest to become the new global technology hub. And therefore, we took the name Valley and
Yeah.
Wisconsin with Foxconn and put that together. But I think there was a lesson learned, a few things that we try. We collect a lot of data and try to actually make it work and make it happen. And without the time, without the resources, we only started maybe the first few steps. But with the likes of Microsoft and others, things are already happening. So that would be the title. That would be some of the topics I'm going to address in the new book. Not so much just what happened,
Right.
but really the vision of Wisconsin Valley is being taken up by other companies and other universities and other people, and they have the potential to really make it happen. What I would like to share is some of those ideas we had, and we were glad that you pursue it and make it happen. Others which have not been made or pursued or really come to conclusion yet could be some ideas that you could actually take a look at and see whether you could take up and make it happen. And I think the fact that we are enjoying a Microsoft investment tells us eventually, this is what our current chairman of Foxconn has said before, each site would has its own use and manufacturing footprint. I'm kind of paraphrasing.
Yes.
Except for I'll use that later.
Mm-hmm.
And if you find out, hey, why are we doing server manufacturing? Why are we seeing a AI data center investment on campus being put up here in Wisconsin? Well, because we have a great set of partners like ReEnergy that put a very stable grid, make the investment on the data transmission, make the investment on providing stable, cost-effective, and reliable power that would actually power literally 1,000 or 2,000 acres of data centers. That's why people would come here. And if you want to do more, we had the ability to do that. By the same token, well, you do need the people. You need not only the engineers, you need the technicians. You need the ability to actually have people come here and go back. So when we look at Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, especially Wisconsin, taking advantage of Milwaukee and Madison, there are two airports there, but the biggest hub, of course, is O'Hare in Chicago.
Right.
And if you're flying private, you can fly into the private jet airport, or you go through Midway.
That's how you fly private jet.
No, I'm a professor. I used to be a professor. Now I'm a startup CEO, so I can't do that. But we are happy to see if you want to come here or you go anywhere around the world, within 12 to 16 hours, between one connection or no connection, you'll be there. It was that compelling of a location. Other places, they have like 2 or 3 airports, like New York, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
You got Atlanta, you got Dallas, and you got Denver. But O'Hare, Chicago, being around for so many years, have all these routes established over the years.
Yes.
Now, after the pandemic, they're coming back.
Yes.
So for a global company, we had talked about the Korean, like Samsung and LG, the likes of the Taiwanese giants of Foxconn, and even the Chinese and the Japanese coming to the Midwest is great for manufacturing, great for investment. Going to the East Coast and the West Coast is also terrific. The founder of Foxconn used to say the East Coast was the financial center that you can actually finance and support and invest.
Yeah, that's right.
The West Coast were the brain, the engineering, the programming, the design concept, but the Midwest is where the shoulders are, where you actually do things and make it happen. So that's how we saw that 5-7 years ago. Is still true right now. So we're pretty bullish about where we are right now. And we see all the great things are happening in Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania for that matter, even though they're kind of between the East Coast and also Midwest.
I want to wrap up with a couple questions for you, some real targeted questions for you, Dr. Young, and this is bigging up your brand. Having gone through everything under the first administration of Donald Trump, you wrote the book Flying Eagle. We're now getting ready to enter into election with Biden and Trump running. What would be your advice for them as a result of what you learned under the first administration for the Make America Great, or as I like to say, Make America Smart? And one thing that you've pointed out that I think our listeners are going to be really excited to hear is the fact that we've always heard the story of the East Coast and West Coast. And I love what you're saying about the Midwest and bringing that back. So what would be your message to the upcoming president?
Well, one of the challenges, actually, there were quite a few when we first came back to the US in terms of reshoring of manufacturing was we need some help. And I think the environment, the narrative were not particularly helpful. And people talk about corporate welfare. It really was not the case because we're competing on a global arena and our competitors had all the advantages. Imagine at some point the likes of Amazon said, you know, I need some help on leveling playing field because Temu is now such a fierce competitor. We need to be open-minded about that. So when we first came back here to the Midwest, and I had literally have gone to Washington, D.C. about 15, 20 times and been to the White House, I
I'm
don't know,
sure.
8 or 10 times, they were beginning to realize some of the challenges and the roadblocks. And some of those they were able to actually make happen and make it easier and remove the roadblocks. But it was still early on, especially from a support from the federal government was basically non-existent. And fast forward a few years later, the Biden administration, credit to them, they actually took that up and be able to create some of the environment and the support in terms of tax credit, in terms of creating the kind of investment and programming, like with the National Science Foundation, some of the work that the Commerce Department is doing, it really is adding on what the Trump administration either did not or could not have done. So now I think that's pretty good. One of the challenges back then and now still is how much strings you actually have when you provide that kind of tax credit, provide that kind of government support, because of our libertarian, it's like, I don't want this stuff. I don't want government meddling with free enterprise.
Right,
So
right.
there's a happy medium somewhere. And we need to find that happy medium to be enough support, but not so much that the invisible hand of the market is now be replaced by the government and the government crowd out everybody and the government actually decided and make winners and losers out of it. I think that becomes a very, very key point. And the other one, I think the Biden administration also find out is at some point we can do certain things from a corporate and industry perspective, but we need some of the red tapes removed or some of the restrictions not applied to us. I know there are, encouragement or rules from those tax credits given to Intel or TSMC and Samsung. Some of these companies were going to do, for example, promoting diversity and inclusion. They wanted to do it, but if you hard code it into a particular tax credit, it becomes a lawful event that takes a pause when you have to sign this dotted line that, well, if I don't do this, what is the legal consequences to my company? Either it's going to be a clawback, or in our cases, either because on paper or verbally you made a promise, it didn't quite happen. The media sometimes is not that friendly, and you make fun of it. So we went through that kind of lessons. So I think the Biden administration had also learned that lesson, and they were particularly protective and supportive with the likes of Intel and TSMC and Samsung, so that they really didn't have that kind of wrath that Foxconn had to face 5 or 7 years ago. I think the environment got a lot better. We were early.
You guys broke the ice.
Yeah, well, Foxconn has always been a pioneer.
Yes.
And sometimes we didn't get right the first time or the second time or even the third time, but the investment made in many cases were worth it. In a very non-digital way, those were the data we generated with a small amount of investment. And therefore, we learned from that. We can actually pivot from there and make better decisions, make better projects, and get better outcome. Now, it's tough to say that $1.5 billion is a small investment or a small price to pay for a lesson. But for a
Yes.
company that is $225 billion in revenue, and if you count the other companies and subsidiaries and investment like Sharp and Innolux, literally every working day, there's at least $1 billion moving around the world, whether it's financial money or whether it's inbound logistics like components or
Yes.
outbound logistics like finished product. So this is a company that's almost like a financial institution, almost like a logistic company, but it's also a manufacturing company. So a small price to pay to learn the lesson, they will do a lot better later on. And the key is not to make major or fatal mistakes, which we did not do here.
Love it. Love it. Dr. Yang, I want to thank you so much for your time. We're very excited about the upcoming book, Risk-Con Valley. I hope President Biden and or Trump tune in and soak up some of the message that you relayed there. That's some valuable insight. I would love to have you back again. You're a wealth of knowledge. We need you. And I love what you also said about, when I talk about Make America Great and what you've channeled in as far as the Midwest sector, the Ohio's, the Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin. This is where the future, right? And once upon a time, that was the gold area, the Iron Belt, the industrial age. And now, you look at areas like Gary, Indiana, that's going through gentrification. They're trying to build back those areas, the downtowns in Ohio, some of those areas, it's, there needs to be this resurgence. And so I think what you said puts America definitely on the right track. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. It's my pleasure.
You just finished listening to another episode of Yo, Check This Out, connecting the streets from LA to the world. Follow Yo, Check This Out on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn for the hottest news in tech. Be sure to hit that like button.